Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome again to the webinar series on West African history before the 1600s. I'm Nick Dennis. We're here with Trevor Getz and Toby Green, and we're going to be looking at Benin today. But just before we kind of launch into that, a couple of things that I think is really important to kind of give us context. Obviously, what's been happening in the US is changing or challenging how we think about history teaching. And there's been lots of discussion around, how we can change our curriculums or curricula. I think the whole webinar series is an important part of that, but it shouldn't just stop there. And there's some other things that, we would certainly urge you to do. And on that, the resources from the webinar series, so the recordings, the PowerPoints, and some of the work that teachers have done will be made available on the West African or the African Kingdom site that Toby has put up with some of his materials as well. And so that will be a repository for all of the resources going forward. So, we want to keep the conversation going. The work is really important, and we really value your inputs as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Toby first, and then we'll go to Trevor. And hopefully at some point we will hear some Jimmy Cliff if I can actually get it working.
Okay, everybody. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Not sure.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Now I can do that. Okay. Now you can. I think. Okay. So hello everybody, and well, we were just talking before. If you've been attending through this series, the kind of impromptu series that came about out of nowhere, really, and this is your fourth webinar, we applaud your stamina, really, because they're all long webinars. There's a lot of new information, and we're just Nick, Trevor, and I are just really grateful for your enthusiasm and your passion to be interested in this. And as Nick said, we're teaching West African history, but always we're teaching it in a context, and of course the context is very, very new. Well, it's not new in a way, but it's becoming new because of the Trump administration and because of what's happening in the US and the global ramifications that is happening. So that makes it even more important, not only that this history, I think, is taught and shared with as wide a section of the population as possible, whatever ethnic background they come from, but also I think that the way in which this history is taught is reframed, is not simply done as African history, if it is in the syllabus, has so often been, until the last 4 or 5 years, been done through victimhood, history of slavery, and so on. That this is actually seen in a different light. And so certainly that's how I think I and all of us, I think, Nick, Trevor, and I have approached this series. And I hope very much that, well, as Nick said, that we can, this is not the end, but the start of an ongoing conversation about how this can get into the classroom, so the young people can become excited and understand themselves and understand the past in a different way. So, Benin, and that's the focus today. And of course, it is probably at either primary or key stage 3, the West African Kingdom, which is most taught in the UK. And obviously there are a lot of reasons for that, principally probably the fame of the Bane Bronzes, the fact that so many of them were stolen by the British and are now in the British Museum, and of course also the long historical connection of colonial relationship between Nigeria and Britain, and the large population of Nigerian descent living in the UK. So all of those things, I think, affect the prominence of Benin in the teaching of West African history, and also why we should teach it, because all of those are relevant factors. Why, particularly in the UK, Benin is a very important aspect of the historical past that students should be able to connect with, whatever their background. So, in this presentation, so I'm gonna really what I'll do in my half an hour or so is pretty much the same kind of thing that I've been trying to do in the previous 3 webinars. So we'll have a outline of Benin's sources for Benin, how it's studied and approached, and then a kind of overview of Benin history, just to give a sort of perspective on the longue durée, really, of Benin's trajectory. And after that introductory part, we'll then move on to the contexts for the study of Benin, some important contexts which will place that overview into perspective. And then finally, we'll move on to a little bit on resources and more resources before I pass over to Trey. And I think questions like the last few times probably is best, you can see there's one popping up in the chat, but I think probably it's best to deal with them at the end. So I think if it's okay, I'll talk through, and then any questions which crop up, I'll try and deal with those at the end of the discussion. Okay, so let's move on to sources. And as if you have been coming to the various different webinars that have been done over the last few weeks, this kind of mix of sources won't be a surprise, and I think that's as it should be, really. For, as we've seen, the pre-colonial African past needs to be approached in a very interdisciplinary way, with a very wide range of different sources, not just written sources, but a whole range of different things. And that's very much true in Benin. And the different sources really give us very different and vital perspectives, which, when they're put together, give us a really important overview. So first would be, I would say, archaeological digs, which were done in the 1970s in Benin City, particularly by Graham Connor and others working at the University of Ibadan. Those digs are very important. They reveal quite a lot of the Benin walls, which we'll talk about a bit later. Also, were very important in terms of copper and copper, which were imported and were part of the manufacturing process of the famous Bane Bronzes. So copper, well, the bronze casting process already existed and predated European arrival, Portuguese arrival, I should say, in the 1480s. And probably, in fact, have been going on since at least the 13th century. But certainly, one of the main items which the Portuguese traded in Benin from that time on, and particularly in the 16th century, were copper arm rings known as manillas. And those archaeological digs are quite interesting from my own perspective as an economic historian. Well, I'm not, well, whatever that might be. One of the things that I found interesting in that is that in all the digs that were done in Benin, only 2 of these arm rings manillas were found, and there were no other. Now, since huge numbers of these arm rings were imported, what happened to the rest? Well, in a fistful of shells, I just thought, they were melted down. And what we also know is that in the 16th century, the manufacture of Bennion Bronzes hugely expanded. So those imports of what we might call money actually were then melted down and used in ways to represent history and identities and royalty, the Obers, the rulers of Benin, and their power. So that brings us on to the Bennion Bronzes, of course, and how those reflect the history of identities, trade and politics in Benin, and those are fundamental and wonderful visual sources, which of course we'll talk about in a bit. There are written sources from European travellers, the Portuguese from the 1480s, and quite a lot from Dutch travellers in the late 16th and the first part of the 17th century. And those do provide quite detailed accounts of Edo, the capital of Benin. And then there are oral histories, and then a lot of historical linguistics, so linguistic analysis, which can be very useful in comparing the Edo language to other nearby languages. For example, Itsekiri, which is was a people. The Wari kingdom, which we'll see in a bit, was founded to the south by people who migrated from Benin, and linguistic analysis can tell us things about relationships between the 2 time period in which that migration took place and so on. So linguistic analysis is also an important part of the mix. Okay, So before I go much further, I will say a little bit about the bronzes, and just as a sort of starter, really. And I know that we'll say more about this later, but just ways in which they can be useful. So this is one from the British Museum, a representation of a Portuguese trader, and you can tell that from the long hair, the beard, and also the representation of the sword and a religious symbol, the olive branch on the right, which shows the mixture of the ways in which Portuguese were seen. This is another one from the British Museum, the Oberoi of Benin, with adjutants. And this is important. Again, you can see the Portuguese in the background with long hair on the left. This is important, I think, because one of the things we need to understand about the Bennion Bronzes is their role in royal histories. One Dutch source we have from the 17th century describes entering the palace of the Ober, and we'll see a photograph of that in a moment, and seeing the walls of the whole courtyard covered with bronzes, and they were histories. They were histories of military escapades of each ruler, and so that's an important factor to understand. That these are representations of history. They are history, just as we think of texts as history. These are texts which help us to understand the past and understand how the people of Benin saw their past, or particularly, of course, how the Obers saw their past and their reigns. And finally, this is the third and final bronze I've picked out. And the reason I picked this one out is it shows soldiers from Benin, the importance of warfare. But I also particularly like a lot of Benin bronzes which show the swords of the rulers of the peoples of Benin, show them in the shape of, well, of a leaf. And I think this is very significant from my perspective, because one of the important concepts which circulated in this part of what's now southern Nigeria, from the, well, we think probably from the 15th century, 1400 or thereabouts, and in what now is Yoruba speaking area. So this is to the north and to the west of Benin, but very connected to Benin, as we'll see in a moment, is Ashe. Now, this is a concept called Ashe, and it's to do with life force, and the life force related to nature and its power and strength. And it actually was a concept which became very important in Brazil, with the large migration of Yoruba peoples to Brazil during the transatlantic slave trade. And so the way in which that's inscribed in military symbology, I think, is quite significant. So those are just some examples of how bronzes can give us perspectives which are very important. And also, I think, well, I think actually I'm taking too long, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so a quick historical overview. So we think that Benin emerged around about 1200. And I think the first 3 or 4 bullet points here are very important because they show how important copper casting was prior to the arrival of the Portuguese. Ife, which was the spiritual and political capital of what became Yoruba peoples, had some kind of Benin had some kind of tributary relationship to Ife. The rulers had to go to Ife to finally be confirmed by the ruler, the Oni of Ife. And there seems to have been some technical help in the forming of bronze casting in Edo. So that seems to have happened around about 1300. Now, the 15th century is a very important time, not only actually in Benin, but in many parts of West Africa. And it was in the 15th century that various kings expanded Benin's power, introduced new religious shrines, and really transformed Benin into the powerful kingdom which it became. Prior to the arrival of the Portuguese arrive at the end of the 15th century, try to bring Christianity, open a trading post, but this doesn't do very well. Slave trade of some kind begins in 1510. There are ambassadors from Benin who go to Portugal by 1514, but very quickly the Obas of Benin, Oba Siji, seeks to control the slave market and clamp down on the traders who are arriving, Portuguese traders who are arriving. Meantime, Benin is expanding. bronze casting is growing very rapidly. It's around about this time that the Itsekiri do break away, we think, from Benin. And then the 17th century is a time of decline, of a succession crisis. And I'll talk about some of the causes of that in a bit. But then in the 18th century, Benin has a certain renaissance, and becomes again a relatively important kingdom in the region, and succeeds in surviving until 1897, when the British seize Benin in a very bloody fight during the scramble for Africa. So that is a history, a very brief overview of dates and times for Benin. Now, here is the Oberoi of Benin's palace. We know that by the end of the 18th century, the palace, there was important parliament, essentially, government of 60 elders who oversaw different aspects: trade, diplomacy, warfare. The palace was often rebuilt and remodeled. I think it's also important to look at this palace because, of course, one of the debates is, should the bronzes be returned? Of course, the question might be, well, why not? And when you see some of the infrastructure which is already in there, which would, of course, be there are museums in Benin and so on, but which will already help to house these bronzes, we can see that's an important point. So now we're going to move on to themes. I'm going to do as quickly as I can. Royalty and diplomacy, achievements, relations with neighbouring kingdoms, and the question of the slave trade. So firstly, question of royalty, religious power and diplomacy. It's very important in teaching Benin to understand the place of the Oba, the ruler of Benin, and the way in which Benin's rise to power, as I've mentioned, becomes more powerful in the 15th century, goes alongside the Oba's accumulation of power. The most powerful Obas actually institute some of the most important shrines in Benin, particularly Oberoi, from around 1440 to 1473, who introduces several new religious cults to deify characters of heroic stories, founds new shrines, establishes new festivals. Again, we can see that's 12 years, 1473, before the Portuguese arrived. And actually really consolidates Benin's power. And we can see that in the way in which the Benin dealt with the Portuguese. They rejected Christianity, missionary efforts failed, and in fact they refused, as we'll see in a moment, to trade in slaves from around 1530. So they were a powerful and strong kingdom, strong enough to say, we don't need the Portuguese, we don't want the slave trade, we don't want your religion, go away. I think it's important to see that this strengthening of royalty and royal power is very similar to what we would call in what European historians call divine right. And I always find it ironic when I think of divine right as somehow some European concept, because it's actually very much a global concept in history. You find it in many different parts of Africa. You found it in the Native American societies. And sumptuary laws governed, as in many parts of the world, when the Obas could be seen by the populace, who could see them eat, and so on. And as with royalty, there was an important diplomatic element of rulership. Ambassadors went from Benin to Portugal at various times, discussed with kings of Portugal about various issues, including military cooperation. In fact, Portuguese troops assisted the Oba in a war against the kingdom of Nupe in 1516. Now, I've been talking quite a lot about some of Benin's neighbours, so let's have a look at a map of Benin's location. So you see bordering to the west, Yoruba peoples, and to the north. To the east, Igbo peoples, one of the largest groups in Nigeria today, and to the south, Itsekiri and Wari, which I've mentioned, and then further north, and this is important, you follow the Niger River up beyond the Yoruba, you'll see Nupe. And Nupe was, and this is significant because Nupe was one of Benin's major foes in this period, major rivals, but Nupe was also connected to the kingdoms to the north, to Kano, the most important city in northern Nigeria. So the Kano Chronicle, which was probably composed in some form or other in the 17th century, and talks about Kano history from a long time back, but begins to get more detailed in the 15th century, describes relationships between Kano and a queen of Nupe called Amina, probably in this period, the 15th century. And so we know that Nupe is connected to Kano. We know that Nupe is also connected to Benin. So we know that Benin has some kind of historical, cultural connections through to the Sahel. So Nupe to the north, near the confluence of the Benue and Niger rivers. Benue is a very important river which comes due west from Cameroon and then joins the Niger. Connected to Kano and the Sahel. Ife, we'll just move up again. Ife, which you can see is to the east of Ibadan and above the main Yoruba marking there on that map, to the northwest of Benin. So Ife was the heart, as I said, the political and spiritual heartland of Yoruba culture, the origin of bronze casting and of the religious and political authority in Benin. And then Wari, we've talked about, to the south of Benin. So it's in this. So I think this is an important point for teaching Benin. We talk about the Bane Bronzes. We recognise their significance, but we should also recognise that in teaching Benin, this is an opportunity to understand the complexity of African societies and polities, because it's connected to many other important societies in this region as well. So by entering into Benin, we can enter into some of that and just give students a sense of that complexity. And here is, Ife, and the significance, I think, of Ife culture today is represented by this as a roundabout in Ife, and it's a representation of the Ife head, the head which is still the focal point of some spiritual practices in Yoruba culture. Okay, I'm now going to move on to achievements of Benin. And firstly, I'm going to talk about the Benin walls. I mentioned these before, but they really are rather remarkable. As you can see, got some of the details here of their length, how much land they enclosed, when they were built. And the bottom bullet point, Guinness Book of Records in 1974, describes the walls of Benin City as the world's second largest man-made structure after the Great Wall of China. They were obviously a huge technical achievement to build them. A ditch and dike structure. The ditch was dug in the form of an inner moat, obviously some kind of protective wall there, probably from Nupe and other neighbours. And this constructed the external rampart. It began to be built towards the end of the 13th century, and there was also smaller such walls built around other important towns and villages. Now, a significant thing, I think, is that this type of structure you also find nearby. So in Yoruba land, you find something called the Shumbos Hereros, which there you see, found in some parts of Yoruba land, and they were also very long, seem to be militarized structures. And the archaeologist Gerard Chouin, who I've mentioned before in these webinars, recently estimated, having done some work on the Hereros, that they were built towards the end of the 14th century. And then I think the significant thing is, again, that their huge expansion is in the 15th century, around the city, and construction of the gates, which were locked as well. So this tells us something of the militarization, but also the transformations which are happening in many different parts of West Africa in this time. I think the other significant achievement, which I'll mention here of Benin, is longevity. I mean, in a way, I'm not going to talk about the bronzes here, because the bronzes are such a sort of glaring achievement that, in a sense, I feel that it's better to talk in the brief time I have about some of the other things which are perhaps less well known. So, longevity and anti-colonialism. So Benin is a kingdom which continues from 13th century, as we've seen, to the end of the 19th century, 1897. Now, that's actually very unusual. Actually, not only in West Africa, but in most parts of the world, that sort of longevity is very unusual. Most of the neighboring kingdoms are much shorter lived. Oyo, which was the central kingdom of Yoruba-speaking peoples, Oueda, which is in the Republic of Benin, or Ouida, Dahomey, which was the successor state to Oueda, all of them, as you can see, much shorter lived. So what was it about Benin, and then I think, which is an important question, was able to be such a long-lived sort of kingdom state? I think we talked already about the religious and political strengths. I think the political strength, the construction of the walls, obviously that's important. And then the development of the shrines prior to the arrival of the Portuguese and the religious strength which that gave the Obers, I think that's important. I think a second fundamental point, and this is one of the things which is very interesting about Benin in the era of the Atlantic slave trade, is that Benin refused to trade in the Atlantic slave trade after 1530 for 200 years almost. And instead, the main exports were cloth. They had a very important cloth industry, and their cloth was bought by Dutch traders until the late 17th century, and may even actually have influenced Dutch manufacturers. I had an interesting email a few months ago from a textile historian talking about the names of Dutch manufacturers in the late 17th century and how he thought they were connected to Benin textiles from what he'd read in A Fistful of Shells. And I think the third thing we have to say about Benin is that Benin was able to shift with the times. It refused the slave trade for a long time, and that did consolidate it. But then in the 18th century, it was impossible to survive, in fact, for a West African kingdom without engaging in some form with it, because you had to have access to the guns which were being imported in order to defend yourself. But it did change with the time, adapt, and it formed new alliances with new kingdoms such as Dahomey. So all of those factors, I think, were very important in Benin's longevity. Fourth context, Benin and the slave trade. And I think Benin is a very good case study for the slave trade if you are going to teach that. Although, as I've said at the start, I think it should come, if you are going to, right at the end rather than at the beginning. These are the factors which I think are really relevant. Firstly, its expansion in bronze casting predates Portuguese arrival and relates to West African political transformations in the 15th century. Secondly, because as we've seen, Benin rejected participation in the transatlantic slave trade for such a long period of time and instead tried to develop its own manufacturing export industry in cloth. And then I think, thirdly, because then if you're going to go into the 18th century, the way in which the slave trade took over West Africa is revealed by the way in which Benin then had to participate in the trade. And there are some good sources you can use there. I'll point up those in a moment. And then fourthly, the transnational nature of Benin, the way in which the trade to the Americas from the Bight of Benin became so important in the 18th century. And finally, the wide range of sources which you can use. So all of those, I think, do make this a good case study. So I've only got a few minutes left. So I'll just finally, just to conclude this, my part, just talk a bit about the relevance of Benin to contemporary themes. I think there are lots of ways in which this history can speak to a lot of different things and really connect to some of your students. I found that teaching it in the classroom, and I'm sure those of you who have taught it will have found that as well. But I think the first I'd point out, it would be the transformation of this representation of the self or identity. And the bronzes really speak to this. They reflect, as we've seen, there's just a few I pulled up earlier. They reflect how Obers saw themselves, saw their history, saw their relationship with outsiders, the Portuguese, and how those were being transformed through this, in this early phase of globalization. So they really reflect changing identities, of course, which is a theme which a lot of us and our students are grappling with. Secondly, I think the importance of ritual connections and identities in political frameworks, like the concept of divine right, is important. This through, for example, the connection to Ife. I think that's important because it can help create a sense of the difference of different West African societies, and that's important. We need to remember vital in contextualizing Africa, remembering that Africa is not a country, but the other connections between them. The fact that Yoruba-speaking peoples in Ife and Edo-speaking peoples in Benin had this connection shows, in a sense, almost a sort of multicultural framework, a cosmopolitan framework within West African societies, which is very relevant to today. I think the refusal of slave trading obviously relates a lot to a lot of contemporary themes and concerns in the teaching of African history and the teaching of Black history. And finally, I think it's a very important example of where Benin gives a very important exemplar, really, of the field of African history. So when the bronzes were found, quotes, by Europeans in the late 19th century, the first academic texts which were written in the early 20th century suggested that they had to have been made either by Portuguese craftsmen or under the influence of Portuguese craftsmen, because it was simply inconceivable to British anthropologists and art historians in the early 20th century that they could have been made by the people of Benin. And it's only really in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that the reality that these bronzes represent Benin identities and Benin's understanding of its own history sinks in. So, and I think this very slow transition reflects Western approaches to African history in the 20th century. So I think if you can communicate some of that, I think that will help students not only to understand the importance of Benin, but also the importance of it as a topic in understanding how and why African histories and African peoples have been marginalized in more mainstream Western narratives. Okay, finally, just briefly, I'm going to go on to some digital resources. So, got a few here. So firstly, British Museum has a classroom resort. I'm sure some of you don't want to visit the shop, but I did know the British Museum has an online shop. I'm sure many of you did too. So you can use, obviously that's available. So I'm sure some of you will know that already. If you read for background material, you can look at the A-level option textbook, which we talked about before for African kingdoms, the OCR option, which has a chapter on Benin. Now, I mentioned this slave voyages website if you're going to look at the 18th century. So you can search for the Bight of Benin. So you can change your date if you go here, 1700 to 1866. And the key thing is to change this to embarkation regions, and then you can see the relative importance of the trade at different times in the 18th century. You can change this if you want to 5-year periods or individual years. And there are other searches that you can do on the website, look at different regions and so on. But so that's a resource that you can definitely look at and explore. And finally, further reading. So I've got here the Bennion Red Book. So this is an extraordinary book which was produced by the Bennion royal household 2 years ago by the Oberoi of Benin, as you see, 7 kilograms of history. And I have this book, and it is very heavy. And you can see there's quite a lot of material here online where you can, well, it's not a cheap book. You see £175.99. But it is very heavily illustrated, and you can only read about it on this site. So that's a good resource to look at. These are some Royal Arts for West African Kingdom by Kathleen Berserk. It's a very good introduction, actually scholarly study, but it has a lot about the manufacture of the bronzes and their context. Bradbury's Benin Studies was one of the earliest books which had a less colonial approach really to Benin from the West, certainly, than previously. Royce and Bondarenko's Popular History of Benin is very good. Has a lot of material from oral histories. Benin and the Europeans by Ryder is one of the classic Western academic texts, and there's quite a bit on Benin in chapter 4 of the Fistful of Shells. So, okay, I think I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions and so on. Nick, have you got questions?
You, Toby. I'm just going to say, because Toby's very modest, and I only found this out the other day, that his book, A Fistful of Shells, has been shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize, which is like the major historical prize in the UK. So if you haven't got a copy, I suggest you get one. There was one question from Emily, and I think you partly answered this, but it was, to what extent did slavery underdevelop Benin?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think really until the 18th century, slavery didn't underdevelop Benin, because Benin was already, as I said, strong enough prior to 1485 and had built its own defences. I think that's pretty important. That it was able to refuse the slave trade. So really until 1700, it didn't underdevelop Benin. And when it did begin to, I think I do mention this a bit in chapter 4 of my book, that what happened essentially was that the cloths which had been exporting for a previous 150 years, 160 years, their value plummeted. They were often exported actually to the Gold Coast, to Elmina, by the Dutch. And at the same time, there was an increasing influx of cloth coming from India via the Netherlands, and demand for Benin cloth fell. They were no longer able to sell it, and therefore the only way in which Benin was able to access, as I said, the firearms it needed in order to increasingly to defend itself from its neighbours and rivals was through participating in the slave trade, which is what it began to do in the 18th century. But that being said, I think the fact that I'd be interested to know what Trev's perspective on this is actually, but I would say that the fact that for the previous over 200 years it had not participated in the slave trade did put it in a stronger position to withstand some of the awful difficulties which came along in the 18th century.
I feel like you summoned me by speaking my name. So
I did.
I appear. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and there is an article by Nathan Nunn, who is an economic historian. Well, actually, he's an economist, who has a very complex way of working through and working out the GDP impact on today's societies of the Atlantic slave trade, based on some pretty significant calculus, and the fact that we have some very good sources through the Du Bois research, which is now online as slavevoyages.org. And you should definitely go there and check it out, slavevoyages.org, if you can. And Nunn's numbers make it look like Benin is in a category in which its GDP today was probably affected somewhat significantly. The region just to the west, according to Nunn's analysis, probably more so than Benin. But Benin definitely, and I like the Nunn article because the Nunn article is actually, it's dispassionate, it is quantitative, but it clearly establishes, I think beyond all reasonable doubt, the impact of the Atlantic slave trade on development, if that helps. Hey, I could share that article very easily also.
Yeah, no, that would be brilliant. So we'll try and get a copy of that or a link to it somewhere in the resources that we'll send out afterwards. There's a bit of a follow-up question to Emily's question. This is from Abby, which is can you go into a bit more detail about why Benin rejected slavery, and more importantly, what made it different to the other areas in rejecting slavery?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Well, the first thing was that after 1530, Benin refused to trade male slaves. So until then, there had been a small slave trade, as I mentioned, Sao Tome. Where did I deal with that? Here, I think. Sao Tome, the sugar-producing islands in the 16th century, begins to apply to Benin for slaves. But actually, what was happening in this period when there was a slave trade for Benin was that the Portuguese were coming from the Gold Coast and were bringing slaves from Benin to their fortress at Elmina, and then they were trading there for gold. And they needed male slaves because one of the things about West African history, which is very important to understand with the slave trade, is the impact of the tsetse fly, and the tsetse fly, which produces sleeping sickness, which meant that it was very hard south of the Sahel to have horses, mules, animals which could carry heavy loads. So the fact that the Benin refused to trade male slaves meant that the Portuguese simply stopped being able to continue with that trade. So that was a choice made by the Benin, and the evidence suggests that it's because of the needs of the kingdom. The kingdom, of course, they usually sold war captives and criminals if they did participate in the slave trade. But they were in military expansion mode, and they wanted to integrate as many as possible within their own armies. So it simply didn't suit Benin's political interests to participate in that. And I think probably recognizing that it would underdevelop and economically be devastating to their political aims. which, as we know from history, was the case.
Okay, brilliant. Abby, I hope that's answered your question. Trevor, do you want to come in on that, or? Oh,
no, I think that's a great answer. And Toby knows this history better than I do.
Okay, brilliant. So just before we switch over to Trevor, I've just got a couple of polls just so we can get an idea. So the first one, so do you teach Benin in your setting? So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Okay, so I can tell you over 70% of the attendees, and we have over 100 people here, say no, they don't actually teach Benin at all. And I'm just going to ask just one more. So where do you teach Benin? What key stage? Because I think that's quite interesting to find out as well. Okay, and just to kind of give everyone a very brief idea here, while it's still coming through, 83% of the respondents are at Key Stage 3, 5% at Key Stage 2, none at Key Stage 4, which is really interesting, and basically 5% at Key Stage 5. But we do have, sorry, just in the Key Stage 4 figure, there's 8% of the respondents, or 10% now, teach it across a variety of key stages. So, yeah, fascinating information, which you should. We'll share some of that information a bit later on. Okay, Trevor.
All right. So, do I have control such that I can share my screen?
You should have a control now.
Now I do. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Just give me 1 second here. No, that's embarrassing. I can't make. Here we go. Well, I guess I'm just going to share my main screen. All right, so there, that should be better. So Nick or Toby, tell me if anybody cannot see my screen, but I assume that you all can see it. I want to say thank you again to all of you committed teachers who are willing after a long day to come out and spend time with us. As always, I'm just incredibly impressed by how well Toby sets up what I'm going to talk about in terms of developing some lesson plans. And again, there's so much to talk about in terms of Benin that Toby provided resources for you to look at to work your own lesson plans. I'm going to focus specifically on those bronzes and building towards a type of usable history, I hope, where we can work towards a debate or a discussion on the Benin bronzes, what they mean, and what that means for whether there is a responsibility to return them. And one thing I'm going to try to do is to model a sort of attempt to really give students a sense of debate there, so that it's not an obvious answer. For me personally, and I would tell my students afterwards, there is an obvious answer here. But I want to try to model a sense of giving them the tools to think through these issues. So we're going to go back then to these bronze plaques, of which there were many hundreds. There are quite a few surviving, mostly in European and US museums, not in Nigeria, obviously, today. And if we can start with just a few facts, okay, what are these things? These are plaques. These are flat embossed artwork, and they're made of brass, right? So, or they're made of bronze. Oops, that's a mistake. They're not made of brass. They're made of bronze. And so they're made of a metal. This metal was a trade metal. They were made by specialists. So you think about who might do this work. It was people who were very specialized, very skilled, and those people worked for the king of Benin, right? They worked for the Oba, and so that's really important knowledge to know before we even just start looking at them. And then I like to go with students and to just look at and comment and think about them and to say what we see here when we look at these plaques. And in some cases, I like to give just a very small amount of didactic information, including the title, but to tell them this is a title that has been put on this piece by the museum at which it's being exhibited, in this case, the Met in New York. But what do we see here? Who is this person in the middle? What does it mean that this person is on the horse? Look, we can look for clues, obviously, in the title of the piece. We can also see who is in the middle and what does it mean for somebody to be in the middle. We can start to think about, and I totally agree with Toby on this, we can start to think about similarities with European art that was also made for and by kings. A lot of statues of kings or paintings of kings or leaders, they're on horseback, showing that they're more powerful. Why is this person bigger than the people around them? Is it because of perspective? Some of them are further away, some are closer. Or does that indicate somehow their importance? What kind of clothing are the different people wearing, and what might that mean? Who is wearing more ritual clothing and looks wealthier, and who is wearing less? And I'm going to discuss all of these issues and what our information tells us in a little bit, but let's just look at these images a bit more. This is one of the most interesting plaques in my perspective, because it is a depiction of the other, of somebody coming from somewhere else. It's a depiction of a European, as Toby noted. The European has long hair and is wearing, you know, a wig, it appears. There are some fish in the image. The European is holding something. What might that be? Is it a cross? What might that mean? What is being said here? How is this person being observed by the metallurgist, by the blacksmith who is making this piece? And since the king is, you know, the one who is funding these pieces, why would he want a picture of Europeans? Why would he want to show off that Europeans were coming to his court? Here, of course, is one of the later and really most exquisite pieces, I think, in terms of competency, in terms of the incredible skill of the person who worked it. It's again, these warriors. I think Toby showed this exact plaque. It's quite a famous one. It does show these weapons. Why would a king want these soldiers on the wall of his palace? Why would he want to show them wearing their armor? And let's look at their armor. Is it purely functional? Is it meant to sort of impress or overawe? You know, in the later years, these soldiers in Benin wore these giant helmets that looked very much like, you know, guardsmen's bearskins. Why do guardsmen wear bearskins? Certainly a helmet is useful, but what's with the shako? You know, it gives them height, it gives them power. What's going on here? Here's one of the king himself, swinging a bunch of leopards in the air and with some fish hanging off of the side of his belt. What the heck is that about? Why leopards? Why did the king want to be associated with leopards? Why do English kings want to be associated with lions? Mudfish, interestingly, really aren't found in Benin. They're found to the north, I believe, or so I've been told. Lions, of course, were never found in England, but why these animals and what might they mean? And why might a king want to show himself associated with these things? So again, you know, questions they can just sort of ponder. Other animals that might be displayed, here's a crocodile eating a fish. Why a crocodile? You know, in all cases, what we're saying is that the king set the tone and the artisans made things that he wanted displayed in his palace. Why would he do this? And here an image of the receiving hall where the king received traders who came to visit or diplomats who came to visit. And again, the question of why he might want to put a picture of his receiving hall with people in it, probably in his receiving hall. You know, why do we display paintings of a place within a place? These kinds of things we can talk about. And here the king showing his servants and courtiers. The most important servant here being the drummer. Note how the drummer is dressed. Why might a drummer be an important servant? What does a drummer do for a king? Why do kings have horns playing? Why is there, you know, again, the guardsmen with the band marching with music at the changing of the guards there in London? So these sorts of issues, and I know that there's a danger. I know there's a danger of trying to directly place Benin within a context of, think of it from what you know of England, of your own society. Admittedly, we must understand societies in their own context, but I do find that these kinds of reference can help us also to think about Benin as a kingdom, just as England was a kingdom, or you know, Britain is a country today, and hence to give us a sense of, you know, a kind of equality of what we're studying. So again, Toby has set me up beautifully to talk about these bronzes and where they're found, about the city a little bit and about the palace. So this is Alfred Dapper's famous image of the city of Benin, drawn in 1668. I'm going to also show you a quote from Dapper. We use this as European written sources, and some of the few written sources and images of this sort that we have of the city of Benin in this earlier period. I do want to say Dapper never went to Benin, and that's a very interesting thing. Dapper interviewed, so Dapper was Dutch, he interviewed many, many sailors coming back from trading in Benin. And some of the reconstructions that he seems to have done were remarkably accurate as far as we can tell. But he was never in Benin himself. And so students should know that when they see this image of the palace. But we're going to help them to think through how accurate it might be through a couple of other things. Here is Dapper's description of the city. And students might note that, I mean, it's a very, very positive, admiring description. It in no way sort of suggests this is some inferior African city. In fact, Dapper talks about, he compares it first to the city of Haarlem. In other words, you know, to Amsterdam, to his own situation. Talks about this magnificent wall, talks about the big palaces and apartments, talks about it being long, having long galleries, the same size as the Exchange in Amsterdam. And students might know that in 1668, or they might not know, but you might tell them that in Europe, the financial center is really this giant exchange in Amsterdam that is, you know, so important. And so again, this is a very sort of positive depiction. It does talk about these copper casts, which are probably actually bronze, not copper. And it does talk about the pictures that are on them. So it gives us a sense that these things were in the buildings and where they were in the buildings, and especially in the palace, that these are well maintained within this royal court. And that there's a small tower on each roof, which has this copper bird on it. And that's how you get then Dapper showing this particular image, the way he drew it, the small roof with a bird on it. Now, we actually have some idea of what these looked like. I'll go backwards in a second, because we have a box also made of bronze that was drawn, that was manufactured in Benin City, showing the Oba's palace. That was quite late in the 19th century, but it does look remarkably similar to what Dapper drew, which gives us some sense that he had really gotten quite a bit of information. Here's a first-hand image of the city. sketched by a British officer in 1897 prior to its destruction. And one thing that we will talk about when we start our sort of debate section here is that the city is destroyed by British forces, and it's at that point that most of these bronzes are taken or looted. Words are meaningful, of course, but again, I'm trying not to predispose students yet to one side of a debate. Here's a map of the walls of Benin City. So again, we get a sense of this city that is large, that has many walls. And what can these walls tell us? They can tell us something about the threats to the city, certainly. They also tell us about the government's ability to mobilize labor. So they give us a sense of a powerful centralized administration under these Oba, under these kings. And here's the roof line of the Oba's palace, again showing those birds on top of small gables, or I guess those aren't gables, but with small towers. This is actually the Reconstructed Palace, which is early 20th century, but it was reconstructed with an attempt to look like the earlier palace by people who had seen the earlier palace, and therefore gives us some sense, again, that Dapper probably was pretty good in his depiction of the palace, had gotten some good information, was being helped to develop it. Okay, so now we know where the bronzes are. They're in the middle of this sort of rectilinear city, within the palace itself, which is meant to be sort of a monumental place that attracts the eye with these tall roofs and such. Let's talk a little bit about what the meaning might have been of these bronzes. And here's what I would share with students and talk through if I were giving this lesson. First, I would talk about the idea of that this is really the king's way of expressing himself and of propagandizing, of convincing, of giving a message to visitors to the palace who might have been his own people, who were certainly his courtiers, but also foreign traders, merchants, and diplomats. And we should know that the fact that the king monopolized these sorts of bronze objects was quite usual to a place that had laws that really marked people in being in different classes. We call these sumptuary laws. Now, by the way, when Dapper writes about these sumptuary laws a little bit, he recognizes them because the Dutch East India Company also had these laws. In the Dutch East India Company in the time, what kind of metal you were allowed to use to close your shoes or tie them together depended on your rank within the company and your status in Dutch society. Sumptuary laws that give some people control over particular materials and objects are pretty common, and were pretty common everywhere, not everywhere, but in Europe as well at this time. So this was something that was meant to impress with the king's power and importance, and to tell a story. And within that story, the way people are dressed, whether they're sitting on a horse, whether they have attendants around them, whether they have their weapons raised, all these sorts of things are important. So you can read into each of these images and you can go back and go through them and you can say, so what is being expressed here? How important is this person versus other people? What does their stance tell you? And one of the things that we know, for example, it's very interesting from oral tradition, is that standing with one hand on the waist and your weapon raised is a signal of loyalty to the Oba, to the king. Or so those who study this particular kind of thing tell us, the experts on Benin. So that's another level at which you can begin to use these images as a primary source, use these objects as a primary source. And then you can connect it to the history that Toby has been telling us. The expansion of city walls, the rise of soldiers, all had to do with an increasingly turbulent environment. We can also talk about, and if we want to set up the debate, we can talk about the fact that Benin was a state that, was trying in many cases to subjugate surrounding territories and control them. It was a militarized state, right? We're not trying to sell them on a merry, old, perfect, peaceful Africa here. We're talking about a state that's doing what states do in many cases. So that's why we have so many soldiers. Now, we cannot actually quantify the percentage of individuals who were soldiers in these bronzes because so many of them were melted down and turned into just money, essentially, in the late 19th, early 20th century. We can also talk about how these images show Benin as a place that survived not just through military means, but also through trade and through diplomacy. And the arrival of Europeans would have been seen as a diplomatic opportunity, just like the arrival of a group from Nupe or a delegation from Oyo or whatever. Benin plays a brokering role in a lot of the trade in the area, including later the Atlantic slave trade. But earlier, as Toby has told us, not so much. Now let's get to the animals, which I think are really interesting because here we're looking at things that are really metaphorical. So again, the leopards in some ways are meant to symbolize very much the power of the Oba, of the king, in the same way as the lion symbolizes the power of the house of Plantagenet and afterwards. So the Oba metaphorically is called the leopard of the house. And you can talk to students about what attributes might a leopard have. They are powerful, they are strong, but they're not necessarily sort of the big, out there bludgeoning tanks. They are the cunning ones. They are dangerous because they use subterfuge. They are graceful. They hide and then they attack their prey. They're very intelligent animals who, know how to master their environment. So that's an interesting discussion. But then you have those mudfish. And what do the mudfish mean? Well, from oral tradition work and from proverb work and such, we know that the mudfish is noted for the fact that it can survive drought. It is a fish that can also live on land. And in fact, people would find the mudfish when they were digging. And again, the interesting thing is that although there are some mudfish in the area, actually the mudfish is a symbol that comes from quite far away. It's very, very well known sort of to the east of this region in particular. And so, so what does the mudfish indicate? It indicates the ability to live in two worlds. And this again talks to this divine right sort of thing that Toby brought up. The ability to live in the ancestral and spirit world and to represent that world, and also to master the physical world in which a person lives. So that particular bronze, the one with the fish hanging off his belt while he's swinging some leopards, is a particularly important one for telling us how kings wanted to depict themselves and be seen, and therefore reflecting some ideas in society. So once we talked about what these bronzes were, I think we get a sense of a debate that can be had about should the bronzes be returned today. And it's really hard to set students up for that debate without quite a bit of prep work. I want to refer you to the fact that there are a number of debates on the Benin bronzes that are set up for key stages that are commercialized and purchasable. I don't necessarily recommend any of them. I didn't invest in paying myself to see them. I'm going to try to give you an alternative to buying a lesson. But certainly if you wanted to have this debate, you could take a look at these lessons and possibly purchase one. I'm setting this up essentially as a debate around the question, should museums be returned return the Benin bronzes to the country of Nigeria? And trying to build on some of the materials I've given you. I'll also at the end of this refer you to a lot of sources you could use to help put together some research and investigation by students into these topics. So in each case, I'm going to give some historical arguments in favor and against returning, restituting, and also some contemporary arguments that have to do with the contemporary world. And this reflects my general belief that we should that a historian's job is to be accurate to the past, but also to interpret for the contemporary world. That's part of what we do. So historical arguments in favor. Certainly it's important that the bronzes were taken in 1897 after the destruction of Benin by British forces. And therefore one can argue that they were essentially, they were stolen, right? And another important historical context is to note that what happens after that is Benin becomes part of a colony under foreign British rule. So it is not a self-ruling organization in that period. And the third historical argument, of course, is really a heritage argument, which suggests that really people should have the ability to control their cultural heritage, to control and to have access to things that are part of their history and that belong to them. And this builds into then our contemporary arguments in favor. And what I've done before is to give different groups of students to actually literally write up some of these arguments, give them to individuals, and to have individuals prepare for a debate. I don't know if you can do that at Key Stage 2, 3, or 4. I imagine it would be hard, but I can only go from my own experience. On contemporary arguments in favor of returning the bronzes. So one can point to the fact that indeed art has been restituted to people from whom it was taken. The big example of this is art that was stolen by the Nazis during the Holocaust, and that has been returned under international law. Of course, this kind of thing can happen. There is a precedent for it. And indeed, the government of Nigeria has asked for art to be returned. And at the same time, we can say that certainly there's very little of this kind of art in Nigeria. In other words, you can go down to a museum and see it. You know, possibly you would have to travel several cities over, etc., but you could do this. People in Nigeria really can't. They can't see the artwork their own ancestors made. But my students, at least, are preconditioned to accept those arguments, and I do try to complicate them so that students can really go through the process of thinking through what this is all about. So here's two historical arguments against restitution. The first is that a lot of the metal, we don't know how much, that goes into these bronzes was in fact paid to the King of Benin in exchange for people that his armies enslaved. So if there's restitution, perhaps it should go not to Benin, but to, you know, the people of the interior who were enslaved through wars. And similarly, you know, there's a justification to be made for the attack on Benin City, which resulted from the deaths of an expedition, of members of an expedition under James Phillips. What actually happened with that expedition is that they were ambushed and killed, but probably not by the king under the orders of the King of Benin, but certainly by some citizens of Benin. And certainly this happened in a time of great tension. And I will point you to a source that can walk you through what actually happened that day. But an argument could be made that the Benin bronzes are spoils of war. And indeed, that argument has been advanced for artwork previously. And in the contemporary world, there are other arguments. One is that perhaps art doesn't belong to just one people. It belongs to the whole world. And it's important that people everywhere have access to see art from other countries. And, you know, students, I mean, my students from that have come up with very interesting solutions, like let Britain retain some of this artwork, but, you know, send to Nigeria some of its great pieces. So there's interesting outcomes there. And finally, there's the argument that Nigerian museums don't have a great track record for preserving art or protecting it from theft, and American and European museums do. Now, I bet as I'm going along, you can think of rebuttals to all of these arguments, because I certainly can. But of course, what we want is we want students to do the work. And so my final slide, I want to turn you to 5 sources that are out there. Other than these password protected, pay to use debates that I can't see, I couldn't find things that were really well written for the students themselves. But I've got 5 great articles here for you. 3 of them are sort of scholarly. Neil McGregor's article, and they're all available online for free for you to read. Neil McGregor's article on To Shape the Citizens of That Great City of the World is all about really London and art in London. Has a big piece on the Bane Bronzes and a big argument about, or a big account of the arguments that have happened about what to do with those British Museum owned bronzes. Salome Kiwara Wilson's piece, Restituting Colonial Plunder, the case for Benin bronzes and ivories, makes a legal argument for why they should be returned. And in doing so, it engages with the question of what is a spoil of war and what is restitution in legal ways. Charlotte Dolvik's, actually, this is an MA dissertation, but a particularly good one on museums and the Benin bronzes. There are bits in there that will be useful for you. For all of them, the language may be above students. I also pointed to 2 newspaper articles. You'll have to decide if your students are able to pull apart those sources based on their level. One is Christine Mungai's Who Are Western Museums Guarding African Artifacts From? That calls for the return. And the other is Tiffany Jenkins from your own Guardian with a sort of provocative article for why Western museums should keep their African treasures. I'm not sure if Jenkins believes what she says necessarily, but she certainly sets up that side of the argument pretty well for students. So if you feel comfortable with them using newspaper sources and you think the level's right, those 2 articles are a pretty good way into the debate, I think. So that's what I have for you today as a potential lesson plan. I think I'll leave it there, noting as always that you are the experts on your students, not me. So talk to you later, or I'm ready to answer questions.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that, Trevor. I'm just going to try and get the questions up. So there was one from Lucy, and she asked a question that she's interested in the oral tradition, which she thinks was used to describe the plot and the musical instruments to tell histories. So do you know what instruments were used?
Toby, I have to summon you, man. This is history of Benin. This is something.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I mean, there were forms of lute, definitely, and drum. Stringed instruments of various kinds circulated widely in different parts of West Africa. So I'm not sure of the names of them, I'll be honest. But I think lutes and drums were very important. Drums, of course, as you noted yourself, Trev, in the bronze with the drummer in the royal procession. And there were praise singers. There were forms of praise singers. The praise singers, the griots that are most famous in West Africa, are generally from the region of Mali, but there were praise singers in Benin as well. That's what I can say.
No, I think that's a good answer. Hopefully, that should help satisfy Lucy's curiosity there.
But just one more thing: if you really are interested in that, I would look at the Red Book, which I mentioned before. That has a lot of information on all that kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to try and find out where it might be available. I'm sure there must be a copy in the British Library or
one of my PhD students walked off with it, and I'm waiting to get it back.
Isn't that always the case?
£200 for a book, yeah, I'd be chasing that too. The next question is from Harriet, and she's asked, can you recommend any reading regarding the shifting meaning of how the bronzes were made?
I mean, the Kathleen Bickford Berserk would be a very good book on that, I think, which I mentioned in my presentation, the Royal Arts of the West African.
I'm just wondering if any of Kana's archaeological reports from Benin City might be useful. I haven't read through them all. He wrote a series of annual reports when he was doing that work, but I have no idea.
It might be quite hard to get.
Contain that.
They would be interesting, I think.
Yeah.
I think that if you can find Connor,
I'm sorry.
NNAH. Otherwise, I think the Bickford Berserk book would be a good one to start with.
Okay, brilliant. There don't seem to be any questions other questions at the moment, so I'm sure people are thinking of different things to ask. But I just want to point out a couple of things. So the handouts are attached to the GoToWebinar control panel, so you can actually download the presentations there. They are on a Google Drive, which I've put the link into the chat. But Toby's also forwarded an article that he's written on Sumptuary Laws previously, so you've got the text there if you want to go through that. And I think going back to, I think what's really clear to me while we've been looking at this is the connections and the comparisons and the contrasts you can make to the history that we usually teach at Key Stage 3 around the divine right of kings, or that particular thing, the kind of clothing and who was allowed to wear particular things as well. So that should really help you to make that comparison and have a really good understanding.
Yeah, I'll just say on the Sumptuary Laws article, I just remembered as Trevor was talking about that I had actually written this article. It's in a book. If anybody wants to use it, it's in a book called The Right to Dress, and it's about sumptuary laws around the world. And this is I tell the story because guess which chapter this chapter is in the book? It's the last chapter, and that's what always happens with African history and something like that. Nobody knows where to put it, so they put it at the end. So hopefully these webinars will somehow begin to rekindle a different approach.
And it may be too late, Nick, but I just emailed you that Nathan Nunn article on the long-term impact of the slave trade. For those fantastic. Of you who like numbers, we may be few and far between, but there are a few of us.
No, I'm glad you've just mentioned that because I was hoping that we were able to share that, and I think that would be a really interesting thing because it's trying to calculate something different. Sorry, my daughter's about to head off to bed and she's running around, so if you can hear the screaming in the background there.
Nick, before we finish, is it at all possible? I mean, I wondered because we had thought we could run a final session next week on a Q&A basis about methods, approaches, which might arise from all of the sessions we've done. But I just wondered, is it possible to run a poll or some kind now to see if anybody would be interested in that?
Yeah, let me get that set up. There are a couple of other questions.
But at the same time, there may be lots of approaches or questions which you'd like now the opportunity for us to talk about in more general terms, perhaps, rather than just a specific.
Yeah, so let me just kind of go through the questions while I set up the poll. So this is from Nancy. On Nancy, I'll come back to that one because that's really long. So from Julian, is there any religious or mythological meanings to the Benin arts? Yeah, that's the question from Julian.
So the one thing I'd say that's yes, right, and that this is part of a cosmology, right, and that cosmology, within that cosmology, there's a sense that how the state is organized and how the universe are organized are connected together. And so what you have to remember is that different people, and I would argue, is that different people in this society are seeing these things in different ways. But the bronze plaques that we have reflect the Oba's, the depiction that he wants to put of himself, being at the center of the intersection between these two worlds, right? And so they're very much about the aggrandizement of the king and the state, and therefore you wouldn't see something, you probably wouldn't see something that is purely religious and separate. It's more that in depicting himself as having these mudfish on his belt and such, he is very much depicting himself as the translator and the intersection between the spiritual cosmos world, if you will, and the state, and therefore focusing on his power. You might think of Louis in Versailles clearly acknowledging God, but not putting up pictures of putting up pictures of God all over the place, but putting up pictures of himself on horseback.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually very interesting, going back to the point you were making, Trev, that it's important to put in each area, people, kingdom in its own context, but it is interesting to look at the parallels. And when we're talking about this, I can't help thinking of all the discussion about the division between church and state, which went on particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. And for somebody from Benin, as you were saying really in your talk, it would be impossible to look at these bronzes and not simply see them as religious as well as political representations. The two were not, in some ways, not entirely divisible. So that, in a sense, that's a kind of analytical division, I would say, that Western academic language has developed in the last 400 or 500 years, which didn't exist at the time.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd add to that, I mean, we're really in agreement there. The only other thing I'd add to that is just there's so much we don't know because so many of the bronzes are gone, right? And there's just there's if we had a fuller range of them, we might be able to say quite a bit more. Which isn't to say, I mean, there are still dozens out there in various museums, but we know that it's a small selection of a much wider corpus of work.
Okay, thank you for that. Alex's question, and she says that we intend to do 5 lessons on Benin pre-1600 and then explore the transatlantic slave trade using Olaudah Equiano's diaries to refer back to his life in Benin pre-slavery. So what key aspects would support her and her department using that work?
Equiano's work.
I mean, that's fantastic. So the one thing I'm gonna say that complicates this a little bit is that, of course, so Equiano's origins and where he passes from are, of course, very complicated. And I'm not even talking about the bigger debate that happens between Lovejoy and Coretta as to whether he was actually born in West Africa or not. I mean, let's put that to the side. But even if he was born in West Africa, we don't know where Aseke was. And we don't know for sure that where he's passing through is Benin along the way. So it makes it really hard. I don't know how to do. I love that you're using Equiano. It's fantastic. I
mean, I think you can use Equiano because there is, as you say, Trev, there is an academic debate as to whether or not he was born in West Africa, because this literary scholar Vincent Coretta found a register in South Carolina in which he said he'd been born in America. So this is a debate, but what we do know is that regardless, he certainly had very good information about South Africa. And as you know, James Sweeter, an American historian, has argued that in fact, regardless of what Coretta found, he was born in the area around Igbo land. I think you can just say, I would just say, historians disagree as to the evidence regarding Equiano's place of birth and origins, but he did have very good information about the surrounding areas from his own experience, and also from the experience of those he met in America, and we can use that to reconstruct the region. And also, I think I would add that the transatlantic slave trade database, which I just showed briefly in my talk, would also be a good support.
Yeah. And now that I think about it, I mean, how interesting would it be to contrast Dapper with Equiano? I mean, Dapper's sort of dispassionate, outsider view of this region, as opposed to Equiano's telling, really this relatable story of an individual and observing the world around him. Interesting contrast.
And that would be actually a really good contrast as well, because it points to questions of historical authority. So people question Equiano, was he born there? Wasn't he? How reliable is this? And as you said, Trev, Dapper actually never went to Africa. He was actually, an armchair geographer. Yeah. That's what he was. He was an armchair geographer who went around Amsterdam interviewing sailors. And nobody says, whilst people do say, Dapper never went to Africa. But they don't, you know, historians don't tend to cite that in their sources. They don't tend to. So, but nobody questions that. But yeah, when it comes to Equiano, people start saying, oh, well, he may not have been born there. You know? So that would actually be a very interesting thing for students, I think, to see the different approaches which some scholars have taken to different sources and how that reflects the kind of narrative which is created. That's a very good historical training for any young historian.
Brilliant. Right, Nancy, I've had a bit more look at your question, which is quite a long one. But essentially, Nancy's asking, can you say a bit more about the influence of the Dutch East Indian companies and the cloth trade, and how it related to the Benin cloth and what happened?
That's you. That's you, Toby, without a doubt.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fascinating question. I mean, cloth was one of the major exports to West Africa during the whole Atlantic trade, and a lot of this cloth, as you said, came from the Dutch East India Company, and the manufactured mainly in Gujarat, but also in other parts of India. And it then became very significant in the British trade to Africa in the 18th and 19th century, cloth from India. What was its impact? Well, we do have quite a lot of evidence from the 17th century that not only Benin, but other kingdoms in West Africa, Alada, Loango, which Alada was in what's now the Republic of Benin, so to the west of Benin, the Kingdom of Benin, and Loango, which was to the north of the Kongo River, in what's now just the Republic of Congo, and also some parts of kingdoms in Angola exported their cloth and exported it to the Americas. Some exported to Europe. We also know that soldiers from the Gold Coast region in Brazil in the 17th century were sourcing their cloth in the Gold Coast in Brazil. So we know that actually cloth exports from quite a wide variety of different parts of West Africa were happening in the 17th century, and that really seems to have completely finished by the 18th century. And essentially, this is an early example of dumping. People talk about economic dumping, you know, the West dumping its cheaply manufactured products and extinguishing local competition. And that was what, in my view anyway, that was what was happening through the process of the 17th century. Cloth imports were growing throughout the West African coast, from the Netherlands in particular. The Netherlands cloth industry hugely expanded in the 17th century, and it was really the bedrock of the growth of Amsterdam as the world's financial capital, which Trevor mentioned. And then also with the cloth imports from India, and that competition, that essential dumping of cheap manufactured cloth certainly from the Netherlands and Britain, meant that locally produced cloth found it harder and harder to compete, and that was essentially why the demand for it had became harder and harder to sustain to the regional export market, which is what Benin was doing originally. It was trading from Benin to the Gold Coast. It's regionally produced cloth. So that, I hope that answers the question a bit.
Yeah, I hope it does too. But I think respect for the longest question that you managed to type in the chat box for me, that one. We've got a couple more questions. So from Anne, can we have a little more detail about the journey of the bronzes to London? If there's anything more that can be said about where they, once they were removed, you know, where did they go? How did they end up I imagine in the British. Sorry, go ahead, Trevor.
No, yeah, and you can. I mean, I'm not an expert in it. I'll tell you that this is discussed somewhat in Dulvik's MA, and in Kiwara Wilson's article as well, which focuses specifically on the legal issues. She has a little bit on there on what actually happens. But you know, I mean, how do they get to the British Museum? I mean, a lot of them are removed from, you know, this is a moment in which the British Museum is becoming more and more important, of course, and there is a very official pathway for things like this to be removed by the expedition and sent to London, you know, to the care of people who are museum curators and things like that at the time. It's quite official. The way in which they get sold to American museums is more interesting in that in many cases it's clearly individual people literally taking them, individual soldiers probably taking them and later selling them for profit as a spoil, as an individual spoil or looting, if you will. So both of those, I know that both of those pathways were used.
Yeah, I haven't got much more to add. Just as an addendum, one of the very earliest academic pieces about the bronzes, interestingly, it was by General Pitt Rivers, and I think relates to the way in which kind of military, but also academic and museum establishments were kind of intertwined, actually, in this period. So, as you say, there were official pathways.
Yeah, I think we should add here that we did ask the British Museum if they wanted to contribute, but I'm sure they were busy and they didn't reply to the email that I sent them this week. I'll move on. Michelle's question is, are women depicted in the bronzes at all?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I have never seen one. Have you?
No, I haven't either. As you say, we only have a small sample, but not so far as we know.
Okay. And I
draw your own conclusions.
Yeah. And I think that is all the questions. And Nancy said thank you, so thank you. That's your answer to Nancy's questions. Managed to do that. So I'm just going to launch the last kind of poll just so we can get an idea about this follow-up session. So would you be interested just in another general session to talk about historical approaches or general questions about teaching West African history? Okay, well, from the answers that I have at the moment, there is almost 100% saying yes on that. So we'll have to think about how that might work. I mean, you know, obviously.
So I suppose we'll see you this time next week then, everybody. We did have, Nick, do you remember we had a series right at the start? You had a spreadsheet with a whole load of questions.
Yes, yeah. So and we for each of the questions that everyone puts in, we do keep them. And there were, you know, I think especially for the first session, there were so many that we couldn't actually to get to everything. So we'll go through some of the questions that were that we didn't have a chance to talk about, and this is going through all of the webinars, and then we'll try and answer them then. So yeah, sorry. Now 99% yes, they would like that.
Okay.
So,
so I think in that case we said it would be this time next week, didn't we?
Yeah, if that's, I just want to make sure. I will send out a confirmation to everybody just to make sure. We'll try and keep it to you know, a shorter time to make it focused as well. And but if you do have any other questions, please send them to my email address, which is on the information about the webinar. And what I will do is I'll just collate them and then give them to Trevor and Toby, and then they can look at, you know, how they might respond to those particular questions as well. Okay.
Okay.
Right. So thank you once again for joining us. You know, it's taken a long time, as Trevor and Toby have said, in terms of the stamina that you've all shown keeping up with this. But I know it's been really valued, especially in relation to what's happening at the moment and the fact that it's free. And thank you once again to Trevor joining us early in the morning in the US. Toby late in the evening when he's got lots of other things to do as well. And thank you all again.
And thanks to you, thanks to you, Nick, for getting us going with this.
I just pushed the buttons. This is all good. So no, I look forward to seeing everyone next week, and we'll share more of the information and especially those articles that both Toby and Trevor mentioned. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye, everybody.